The wind howling through the Appalachian pines didn't sound like nature. It sounded like grief. When the temperature plummeted to 30 below zero, shattering Oak Haven's century-old records, the town didn't just freeze, it died. People huddled by dead radiators, burning their own furniture, praying for a dawn that wouldn't warm them. But Evelyn Mercer wasn't in her farmhouse. She was 60 feet underground, sitting on a plush velvet armchair inside a sealed limestone cave, staring at a framed photograph her dead husband had hung on the damp rock wall. She thought she was hiding from the cold. She was wrong. Evelyn Mercer was drowning in dry land. It had been exactly 8 months since the state troopers knocked on her door, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the fresh spring mud of her driveway. They told her that her husband, Thomas, had driven his pickup truck off the edge of Miller's Ridge. The vehicle had burned, and with it, the life Evelyn thought she knew. At 42, Evelyn was left with a sprawling, 400-acre property of dense, unforgiving Pennsylvania timberland, a farmhouse with a failing roof, and a mountain of secret debts Thomas had somehow accrued in the final 2 years of his life. The bank notices arrived first in stark white envelopes, then in threatening yellow, and finally in demand notice red. But the bank wasn't the most immediate threat. That title belonged to Arthur Mercer, Thomas's older brother. Arthur was a man who looked like the rough-hewn timber he dealt in, hard, scarred, and uncompromising. Ever since the funeral, Arthur had been a relentless shadow, offering to take the burden off Evelyn's hands by buying the land for pennies on the dollar. He claimed it was out of familial duty, but Evelyn saw the predatory gleam in his eyes. There was something on this property Arthur wanted desperately, and Thomas's sudden death had only accelerated his greed. On a bleak Tuesday in late November, the sky above Oak Haven bruised into a deep, violent purple. Meteorologists on the crackling AM radio were sounding alarms about a polar vortex unlike anything the eastern seaboard had seen in 100 years. They called it the freeze of the century. Evelyn was in the kitchen, wrapping exposed pipes in old rags, when the heavy crunch of tires on gravel announced Arthur's arrival. His silver, heavy-duty truck parked entirely too close to her front porch. Arthur didn't bother knocking. He pushed the kitchen door open, letting in a blast of frigid air that made Evelyn shiver through her wool sweater. "You haven't signed the papers, Evie," Arthur said. His voice a low rumble. He stood in the doorway, blocking her only exit, his boots tracking dirty snow onto her linoleum floor. "The price you offered wouldn't even cover the mortgage Thomas took out, Arthur," Evelyn replied, keeping her voice remarkably steady despite the rapid pounding of her heart. She gripped the heavy cast-iron wrench in her hand just a fraction tighter. "You're a proud woman, I'll give you that," Arthur sneered, stepping closer. "But pride doesn't burn in a fireplace. The radio says it's dropping to -30 by tomorrow night. Power lines are already snapping up in the county over. You can't survive out here alone. Sign the deed. Take the cash. Go to a motel in the city before you freeze to death in this rotting house." "I'm not leaving my home," she said, raising her chin. Arthur's eyes darkened. He took another step, his massive frame towering over her. Thomas was a fool, but he knew when to fold. "You're just stubborn. If the cold doesn't push you out, the bank will. Or maybe something worse." He lingered for a moment, letting the threat hang in the freezing air between them before turning on his heel. "I'll be back tomorrow night. Have your bags packed." When the door slammed shut, Evelyn collapsed into a kitchen chair, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She needed to understand what was happening. She needed to know why Thomas had mortgaged their home to the brink of foreclosure and why Arthur was so desperate to claim it. Driven by a sudden, desperate energy, Evelyn marched up the narrow, creaking stairs to the attic. It was the only place she hadn't thoroughly cleaned out since the funeral. Thomas was a private man, often spending days locked in his study, but the attic was where he kept his oldest belongings. She tore through cardboard boxes, inhaling dust and the smell of old paper. Underneath a pile of moth-eaten winter coats Her fingers brushed against something hard and metallic. It was a heavy, military-style lockbox. The combination dial mocked her, but Evelyn knew her husband. He was never one for complex sentimentality. The latch clicked open. Inside lay a collection of bizarre items. Stacked bundles of $100 bills, easily $10,000 in cash, a loaded revolver. But what caught Evelyn's eye was a hand-drawn topographical map of their property and a small, leather-bound journal. She unfolded the map. A red circle was drawn near the far eastern edge of their land, an area known locally as the Devil's Jaw because of its treacherous limestone ravines. Next to the red circle, Thomas had written one word: sanctuary. Evelyn opened the journal. The entries were erratic, written in Thomas's cramped handwriting. October 12th. The ventilation is finally installed. Arthur doesn't know. He thinks the money went to the offshore accounts. If he finds out what I'm hiding, he'll kill me. The cave is the only safe place left. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The cave? She flipped to the final entry, dated 2 days before his fatal car crash. The walls are sealed. The generator has 3 months of fuel. I've moved the bedroom down there. It feels like madness, but it's the only way to protect her. The winter is coming, but the cold isn't what we need to fear. Evelyn stared at the pages, her mind racing. Protect her? Was Thomas talking about Evelyn? Or was there another woman? The sheer absurdity of it, a bedroom in a cave, hidden deep in the Pennsylvania woods, felt like the plot of a fever dream. But the $10,000 sitting in the box was very real. And Arthur's threats were very real. She looked out the attic window. The snow had started to fall. Thick, heavy, and blindingly fast. If she was going to find out what Thomas had hidden in the Devil's Jaw, she had to go now, before the storm buried the truth forever. The hike to the eastern ridge took nearly 2 hours. Normally, it would be a brisk 40-minute walk. But the snow was already halfway up Evelyn's calves, and the wind was acting like a physical barrier, shoving her backward with every step. She wore 2 layers of thermals, Thomas's oversized hunting parka, and carried a heavy-duty flashlight and the revolver she'd found in the lockbox. The Devil's Jaw was a desolate, ugly stretch of land. It was a chaotic jumble of jagged limestone boulders and dead, twisted pines that had been struck by lightning decades ago. Evelyn checked the hand-drawn map, her fingers numb inside her thick gloves. She navigated between 2 massive rock formations that formed a narrow, V-shaped chute. The map indicated the entrance was here. At first glance, there was nothing but snow, stone, and dead brush. But as Evelyn stepped closer, she noticed an unnatural symmetry to a pile of dead pine branches piled against a sheer rock face. She dropped to her knees, ignoring the biting cold of the snow, and began pulling the branches away. Beneath them was a heavy, military-grade camouflage tarp, frozen stiff. Gritting her teeth against the pain in her freezing fingers, she hauled the tarp back. Evelyn gasped. Embedded directly into the ancient limestone was a heavy, reinforced steel door. It looked like the hatch of a submarine, complete with a massive iron wheel in the center. It was completely incongruous with the wild, untamed nature surrounding it. It was a violent intrusion of industrial engineering into the earth. She stepped up to the door and gripped the iron wheel. It was frozen fast. Desperation fueling her adrenaline, Evelyn braced her boots against the rock wall and pulled with everything she had. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, with a loud, shrieking crack of breaking ice, the wheel groaned and began to turn. She spun it until the internal latches disengaged with heavy, metallic thuds. Evelyn grabbed the handle and heaved the door open. A wave of air hit her face. It wasn't the freezing, biting wind of the incoming blizzard. It was cool, stale, and smelled faintly of lavender. Evelyn clicked on her heavy-duty flashlight, the beam piercing the absolute darkness of the cavern. Directly inside the door was a narrow vestibule carved from the rock, and a spiral metal staircase plunging straight down into the abyss. With her heart hammering against her ribs, Evelyn stepped inside and pulled the heavy steel door shut behind her, cutting off the howl of the wind. The silence that enveloped her was absolute, almost deafening in its intensity. She began her descent. The metal stairs clanged softly beneath her boots. 10 steps, 20 steps. The air grew progressively warmer. 30 steps. At the bottom, her flashlight beam illuminated a short tunnel, its walls reinforced with steel beams. She walked to the end of the tunnel and stopped dead in her tracks, the flashlight trembling in her hand. Thomas hadn't just found a cave. He had built a home inside one. The cavern was massive, easily the size of her entire ground floor back at the farmhouse. But it wasn't raw rock. The walls had been framed and covered in moisture-resistant drywall, painted a soft, calming beige. A thick, plush, cream-coloured carpet covered the floor, neutralizing the echo of her footsteps. But it was the centre of the room that made Evelyn's breath catch. There, sitting under the warm yellow glow of a battery-powered standing lamp, was a complete, immaculate Victorian-style bedroom. A massive, intricately carved mahogany four-poster bed dominated the space, covered in a heavy down comforter and an array of perfectly arranged pillows. Flanking the bed were 2 matching nightstands. On one rested a stack of classic novels. On the other, a framed photograph. Evelyn walked slowly toward it, her mind unable to process the sheer impossibility of the space. She picked up the photo. It was a picture of her and Thomas on their honeymoon in Charleston, smiling, oblivious to the nightmare their lives would become. Against the far wall sat a plush velvet armchair, a small oak writing desk, and a heavy wooden wardrobe. A sophisticated air ventilation system hummed quietly near the ceiling, drawing fresh air from somewhere above. Off to the side, behind a partition, she could see the gleam of a state-of-the-art silent generator hooked up to a massive reserve of fuel tanks. This wasn't a bunker for a doomsday prepper. This was a sanctuary. It was intimate. It was domestic. Evelyn sank into the velvet armchair, her legs suddenly refusing to hold her weight. Why? Why go to these astronomical lengths, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to build a secret bedroom underground? She thought back to the journal entry. If Arthur finds out what I'm hiding, Thomas hadn't been hiding money down here. He had been preparing to hide a person. But who? Himself. Her. Evelyn stood up and walked over to the heavy wooden wardrobe. She pulled the brass handles, half expecting to find Thomas's old clothes, or perhaps supplies. The wardrobe swung open. Evelyn stumbled backward, a cry escaping her lips. It wasn't filled with Thomas's clothes. It was filled with women's clothing. But they weren't Evelyn's sizes. They were much smaller, delicate, expensive garments, silk dresses, cashmere sweaters, tailored wool coats, and sitting neatly on the bottom shelf were 3 pairs of women's shoes. Size 6. Evelyn was a size 8. A cold dread, far more chilling than the blizzard outside, washed over her. Thomas had a second life. He had built a subterranean palace for a woman who was entirely unknown to Evelyn. The grief she had carried for 8 months instantly curdled into a sickening, acidic betrayal. She wasn't standing in a sanctuary to protect her. She was standing in a monument to her husband's lies. She needed to leave. She needed to get back to the farmhouse, pack her car, and drive as far away from Oakhaven, from Arthur, and from Thomas's ghost as the roads would allow. But as she turned back toward the spiral staircase, a violent, shuddering boom echoed from the ceiling above. The rock around her vibrated. The storm had hit. The sound from the surface was terrifying, even from 60 feet underground. It sounded like freight trains crashing into the mountain. Evelyn scrambled up the metal spiral staircase, her chest heaving. She reached the steel hatch and pushed against it. It didn't budge. Panic flared in her chest. She braced her back against the stairs, put both hands flat against the cold steel, and shoved with the strength of absolute terror. The door moved a fraction of an inch, just enough for Evelyn to see what had happened. The blizzard had escalated from a heavy snowfall into a catastrophic whiteout. A massive, dead pine tree, uprooted by the hurricane-force winds, had crashed directly across the entrance of the ravine, its heavy trunk wedged against the outer face of the steel hatch. She was trapped. For 10 minutes, Evelyn threw herself against the door, screaming until her throat was raw, but physics was an unforgiving master. The tree, combined with the rapidly accumulating ice and snow, had sealed the tomb. Defeated, exhausted, and trembling, Evelyn slowly descended the stairs back into the bizarrely pristine bedroom. The silence of the cave, which had felt peaceful an hour ago, now felt oppressive. She was buried alive. She walked over to the generator panel. Thomas had been meticulous. The instructions were typed and laminated, taped directly to the machine. Evelyn flipped the necessary switches and pressed the ignition button. The generator roared to life with a deep, reassuring thrum. Immediately, the standing lamps flickered on with greater intensity, and a baseboard heating system began to pump warm air into the cavern. Evelyn stripped off her soaking wet parka and heavy boots, leaving them near the entrance tunnel to dry. She walked back into the center of the room, her stockinged feet sinking into the plush carpet. The temperature was rising, reaching a comfortable 70 degrees. Above her, she knew the world was dying in -30-degree cold. She looked at the mahogany bed. The betrayal still stung, a sharp, twisting knife in her gut, but the adrenaline crash was overwhelming. She was safe, she was warm, and she was alive. The storm would pass, eventually. Arthur couldn't get her here. She would figure out how to escape when the weather broke. She walked over to the velvet armchair and collapsed into it. For the first time in 8 months, she allowed herself to truly cry. She cried for Thomas's death. She cried for his lies. And she cried for her own absolute isolation. Hours passed. The hum of the generator became a hypnotic lullaby. Evelyn dozed in the chair, her mind playing fragmented, nightmarish loops of Arthur's face and Thomas's car burning in the snow. She woke with a start. The lights in the cavern were still on. The air was still warm. But something had changed. The hair on the back of Evelyn's neck stood up. It was a primal, instinctual reaction, the sudden, terrifying realization that her environment had shifted while she slept. She stood up slowly, her eyes scanning the room. The wardrobe was still open. The framed photo was still on the nightstand. Then she saw it. On the opposite nightstand, the one she hadn't touched, sat a white ceramic mug. Evelyn hadn't brought a mug down here. She walked toward it, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her hand trembled as she hovered her fingers over the rim of the mug. It was radiating heat. A thin wisp of steam curled upward into the air. The sharp, bitter scent of black coffee reached her nose. Evelyn spun around, her eyes wide with terror, scanning the edges of the cavern where the light from the lamps faded into impenetrable darkness. She wasn't alone. Someone else was in the cave. "Who's there?" Evelyn demanded, her voice cracking, echoing off the limestone walls. "I have a gun," she realized, with a sickening jolt, that she had left the revolver in the pocket of her parka, 20 feet away by the entrance tunnel. From the shadows behind the hum of the generator, a figure stepped forward. Evelyn stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the mahogany bed. It wasn't Thomas. It wasn't Arthur. It was a woman. She looked to be in her late 20s, with pale skin, dark, hollow eyes, and a look of absolute, feral desperation. She was wearing one of the oversized cashmere sweaters from the wardrobe, the sleeves hanging past her hands. In her right hand, she held a heavy, rusted iron pry bar. "You shouldn't have come down here, Mrs. Mercer," the woman said, her voice a raspy whisper that cut through the mechanical hum of the room. "Thomas promised me you would never find this place." The heavy silence of the cavern stretched, broken only by the mechanical thrum of the generator and the frantic, shallow breaths escaping Evelyn's lungs. She pressed her back against the solid mahogany frame of the bed, her eyes locked on the rusted pry bar in the stranger's pale, trembling hand. "Who are you?" Evelyn's voice was a harsh whisper, stripped of its usual warmth. "How long have you been down here?" The woman didn't move to attack. Instead, her shoulders slumped, the heavy iron bar lowering slightly toward the plush carpet. Up close, under the warm glow of the standing lamp, Evelyn could see the ravages of severe stress etched into the woman's face. She had dark circles under her eyes, her cheekbones were painfully sharp, and the oversized cashmere sweater hung off her frail frame like a shroud. "My name is Meline," the woman said, her voice gravelly and dry. "Madeline Reed." Evelyn searched her memory, sifting through the sparse list of Thomas's colleagues, friends, and acquaintances. The name meant nothing to her. "Ah, were you his?" Evelyn couldn't bring herself to say the word mistress. The humiliation was too sharp, too fresh. Madeline let out a dry, humorless laugh that ended in a rough cough. She walked over to the nightstand, deliberately keeping her distance from Evelyn, and picked up the steaming mug of coffee. A lover? God. No. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Mercer. I really am. I saw your face when you opened that wardrobe. I asked Thomas not to buy those things, the dresses, the perfume, but he said he needed the cover. He said if Arthur ever tracked his credit card receipts, a secret mistress was a believable lie. It's a classic, pathetic trope. Men hide mistresses. They don't hide whistleblowers." Evelyn blinked, the acidic burn of betrayal in her chest faltering, replaced by a sudden, sharp confusion. "Whistleblowers? From what?" "Thomas owned a failing timber lot." "Thomas owned the land," Madeline corrected, taking a slow sip of her coffee. Her hands were shaking so badly the ceramic clinked against her teeth. "Arthur owns the county. Or, at least, the sheriff, the local transport union, and the zoning board." Madeline slowly lowered herself onto the edge of the velvet armchair, resting the pry bar across her knees. She looked up at the ceiling, where the faint, muffled tremors of the blizzard could still be felt. "I was Arthur's senior bookkeeper," Madeline began, her eyes dark with haunted memories. "For 5 years, I managed the payroll for Mercer Heavy Timber. A year ago, I started noticing discrepancies. Ghost trucks, loads of timber that were logged, shipped, and paid for, but never actually existed on the Stateway Station manifests. Arthur wasn't just cutting down trees, Mrs. Mercer. He was using the logging routes to move unregulated chemical precursors down from the Canadian border, right through this valley, and into the hands of pharmaceutical black markets in the Rust Belt. Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. She sank onto the edge of the mattress, the plush-down comforter offering no warmth against the sudden chill radiating from her own bones. "Arthur is a bully," Evelyn stammered. "He's greedy, but a smuggler? A cartel runner? He's a monster," Madeline said flatly. "I copied the ledgers. I downloaded the encrypted routing numbers to a pair of hard drives. I was going to take it to the FBI field office in Pittsburgh, but Arthur caught me, making the copies." Madeline pulled the collar of the cashmere sweater down slightly, revealing a jagged, ugly purple scar tracking across her collarbone. "His men caught me in the parking lot. They were going to throw me in the wood chipper at the old mill. Thomas was there. He had come to beg Arthur for a loan extension. He saw them dragging me. He didn't just walk away, Evelyn. He grabbed a tire iron, cracked one of the foremen across the jaw, shoved me into his truck, and drove." Tears pricked Evelyn's eyes. This sounded like her husband. Thomas wasn't a cheat. He was a fiercely protective man who couldn't stand by and watch the weak be broken. "He brought me here," Madeline whispered, gesturing to the lavish, bizarre bedroom. He had found this cave system years ago and had been outfitting it slowly as a doomsday shelter. "When he brought me here, he sealed me in. He promised he would take the hard drives to the feds himself. He said it was too dangerous for me to leave until Arthur was in handcuffs." Madeline looked down at the floor. a tear finally spilling over her dark lashes. But he never came back. I listened to the emergency weather radio down here. That's how I heard about the crash on Miller's Ridge. They said his truck caught fire. I knew right then. It wasn't an accident. Arthur killed him to stop the drives from reaching the FBI. And I've been hiding like a rat ever since. The revelation hung in the air, heavier than the limestone ceiling pressing down on them. Evelyn buried her face in her hands. The grief that had been a dull, constant ache for 8 months suddenly sharpened into a blinding, agonizing fury. Thomas hadn't driven off that cliff in a moment of despair or carelessness. He had been murdered, and the man who ordered it had been sitting in her kitchen just hours ago, tracking snow onto her floor and threatening to take her home. "Where are the drives?" Evelyn asked, dropping her hands. Her voice was no longer trembling. Meline gestured weakly toward a faux wood panel behind the wardrobe, hidden in the rock wall. "But they don't do us any good if we die down here." Evelyn stood up. She walked past Meline, toward the dark entrance tunnel where she had left her soaking wet parka. She reached into the deep fleece pocket and pulled out the heavy, cold revolver. Meline flinched, instinctively gripping the pry bar. "Relax," Evelyn said, checking the cylinder. 6 hollow-point rounds gleamed in the dim light. She snapped it shut with the authoritative click. "I found it in Thomas's lockbox in the attic, along with the map to this place. If Arthur finds out you have the map, he'll tear the farmhouse apart," Meline warned. "He knows the drives have to be somewhere on the property. That's why he's been trying to force you out. Once he legally owns the land, he can bring in ground-penetrating radar, heavy excavators, whatever he needs to find my hiding spot and destroy the evidence." "He's not getting the land," Evelyn said, walking back into the center of the room. "And he's not getting away with Thomas's murder." Before Meline could respond, the steady, rhythmic hum of the generator, the mechanical heartbeat keeping them alive, stuttered. Both women froze. The lights flickered, dimming to a weak, sickly orange before surging back to full brightness. Then, the generator coughed. It was a harsh, metallic grinding noise that sounded like gravel in a blender. "No," Meline breathed, dropping the pry bar and sprinting toward the partition where the machine sat. Evelyn was right behind her. The digital display on the control panel, which had glowed a reassuring green, was now flashing a harsh, urgent red. Fuel line. Pressure drop. Thomas wrote in his journal there was 3 months of fuel, Evelyn said, staring at the massive reserve tanks lined up against the rock wall. "You've only been down here running it sporadically, right?" "I barely run it at all," Meline shouted over the sputtering engine. "Only an hour a day to keep the temperature above freezing and to run the air scrubbers. There should be hundreds of gallons left." Meline grabbed Evelyn's flashlight and dropped to her knees, shining the intense beam under the primary reserve tank. A dark, slick puddle was pooling rapidly on the concrete pad beneath the tanks. The sharp, toxic smell of diesel fuel hit Evelyn's nose, making her eyes water. "The main line is sheared," Meline gasped, her fingers hovering over a heavy rubber hose that was visibly split, leaking fuel at an alarming rate. It looks like it dry rotted. Or maybe the pressure from the cold front caused a micro-fracture to burst. "Can we patch it?" Evelyn asked, dropping to her knees beside her. "With what?" "Tape won't hold industrial fuel pressure. We have to shut the valve from the main tank to stop the leak. But the secondary tank is already empty." Meline reached up and wrenched a heavy brass valve closed. The leaking immediately slowed to a drip, but the damage was done. The generator gave one final, violent shudder. The engine choked on air, sputtered twice, and died. Instantly, the standing lamps went black. The total, suffocating darkness of a subterranean cave slammed into them. It was a darkness so absolute, it felt like a physical weight against Evelyn's eyes. The only light remaining was the narrow, focused beam of Evelyn's flashlight. The silence that followed the engine's death was terrifying. There was no hum, no whir of the air ventilation fans. "How long until we freeze?" Evelyn asked, her breath already visible in the flashlight beam as the cavern's artificial heat began to bleed rapidly into the surrounding 60-degree limestone. The cave naturally sits around 55 degrees, Meline whispered, her teeth beginning to chatter from the immediate drop in the room's temperature, compounded by her sheer terror. We won't freeze to death, but the air scrubbers are off. If that tree is sealing the top hatch completely airtight, we have maybe 12 to 15 hours before the carbon dioxide poisoning puts us to sleep permanently. Evelyn swept the flashlight beam around the suddenly hostile bedroom. The luxurious mahogany bed and the velvet armchair now looked like props in a tomb. We need to get to the surface, Evelyn said, her grip on the revolver tightening. We have to try to force that hatch open. If we can just crack it, we'll get air. You said there was a tree on it. We have a pry bar, Evelyn countered fiercely. We have adrenaline. I'm not dying in a hole in the ground so Arthur can keep his empire. Evelyn turned the flashlight toward the metal spiral staircase. As the beam hit the first metal step, a sound echoed down from the ceiling. It wasn't the howling wind of the blizzard. It was a sharp, rhythmic CLAing. Metal striking metal. Someone was up there. Someone was chipping away at the ice and the tree on the outside of the steel hatch. Meline let out a whimper and scrambled backward, hiding behind the heavy wooden wardrobe. Evelyn clicked off the flashlight, plunging them back into absolute darkness. She raised the revolver in the pitch black, aiming it blindly toward the top of the stairs, her heart hammering a frantic, deafening rhythm in her ears. The scraping stopped. Then, the heavy, metallic screech of the hatch wheel turning began to echo down the shaft. The metallic shrieking of the heavy iron wheel turning echoed down the limestone shaft like the cry of a dying animal. Evelyn stood at the base of the spiral staircase, her arms raised, both hands gripping the heavy revolver. Her finger hovered just millimeters from the trigger. The absolute darkness of the cavern felt suffocating, broken only by the thin, trembling beam of her flashlight aimed straight up the stairwell. Behind her, she could hear Madeline's panicked, shallow breathing. The temperature in the cavern was plummeting rapidly without the generator's heat, the residual warmth being sucked out by the freezing rock walls. With a final, violent crack, the steel hatch above was forced open. A blast of wind roared down the shaft, bringing with it a torrent of pulverized snow and air so unspeakably cold it felt like shattered glass hitting Evelyn's skin. The air scrubbers were dead, but the sudden influx of oxygen was violent. A heavy pair of boots appeared at the top of the stairs, slipping wildly on the frosted metal. A large figure tumbled through the opening, desperate to escape the vortex outside. The person grabbed the railing, missed, and fell the last 10 steps, landing with a heavy, agonizing thud at the base of the stairs, just 2 feet away from Evelyn's boots. Evelyn immediately leveled the gun at the figure's head, clicking the flashlight beam directly into their face. "Don't move! I swear to God. I will pull this trigger," the figure groaned, throwing a thick, heavily gloved hand up to shield their eyes from the glaring light. He was a man, perhaps in his late 30s, clad in a high-visibility extreme-weather survival suit that was caked solid with ice. His face was wrapped in a thermal balaclava, leaving only a pair of dark, desperate eyes exposed. Frost clung to his eyelashes. He was shivering violently, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. Don't shoot," the man choked out, his voice muffled by the thick fabric. He slowly raised his empty hands, keeping them flat where Evelyn could see them. "My name is Dominic Rossi. Are you Evelyn Mercer?" Evelyn didn't lower the gun. "Who sent you? Was it Arthur?" "No." Dominic coughed, a wet, rattling sound. He slowly pulled the heavy balaclava down over his chin. His lips were a dangerous shade of blue. "I don't work for Arthur. I work for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Organized crime task force out of Philadelphia." From the shadows behind Evelyn, Meline let out a sharp gasp. "The FBI? How did you find us?" Dominic kept his eyes glued to the barrel of Evelyn's revolver. Thomas contacted my field office 3 weeks before he died. He used a burner phone, said he had evidence of a massive illicit chemical pipeline running through the Appalachian logging routes. He sent us coordinates to a dead drop on this property. But before we could bring him in for a formal debrief, he was killed. Evelyn felt a sharp ache in her chest. Thomas had been trying to do the right thing. He had tried to fix it. The local sheriff ruled it an accident. So our jurisdiction was immediately challenged, Dominic explained, his shivering making his words clipped. Arthur has half the county judges in his pocket. We couldn't get a warrant to search the property. So, I came off the books. I've been tracking the GPS module Thomas hid in his own truck. The ping history showed he spent days out here at the Devil's Jaw. When the vortex hit, I knew Arthur's men would be pinned down, so I brought a modified snowcat up the ridge to find whatever Thomas was hiding. He was hiding me, Meline said, stepping slowly into the flashlight beam, wrapping her oversized cashmere sweater tightly around her frail shoulders. And the ledgers. Dominic's eyes widened as he looked at Meline, taking in her emaciated state and the bizarre, pitch-black bedroom behind them. Meline Reed? Arthur reported you missing months ago. He told the police you embezzled company funds and fled to Canada. He's a liar! Evelyn spat, her grip on the gun finally relaxing just a fraction. Meline has the hard drives, but the generator just died. We're freezing, and if we stay down here, we'll suffocate. Then we need to move. Now, Dominic said, forcing himself to his feet. He swayed slightly, gripping the metal railing for support. I parked the snowcat on the other side of the rock formation. The heating cabin is running, but the wind is clocking 80 miles an hour up there. The ambient temperature is -34. Flesh freezes in less than 2 minutes. We have to wrap you both in whatever you have, grab the drives, and make a run for the transport. I'll get them, Meline said, darting toward the back wall. Evelyn turned to the wardrobe, tearing open the heavy oak doors in the dark. She grabbed the thickest wool coats, silk scarves, and heavy down comforters she could find. She tossed a pile of clothes to Meline, who was frantically prying loose a faux wood panel near the baseboards. Meline reached into the dark crevice and pulled out a heavy, waterproof pelican case no bigger than a paperback book. "Put these on," Evelyn ordered, shoving a heavy parka and 2 scarves at Meline. Evelyn grabbed Thomas's hunting coat and wrapped a thick wool blanket over her head and shoulders, tying it around her waist with a belt. Dominic pulled his balaclava back over his face. "Hold on to the person in front of you. Do not let go. If you wander off the path in that whiteout, you will disappear, and I won't be able to find you. Ready?" Evelyn clutched the revolver in her pocket with one hand and the heavy wool blanket with the other. She looked around the pitch-black bedroom one last time. It had been her husband's final, desperate gamble to save a life, and it had almost become a tomb. "Let's go," Evelyn said. Climbing the spiral staircase was like walking into a meat freezer. By the time they reached the vestibule just inside the open steel hatch, Evelyn's lungs were burning. Dominic pushed the hatch open as far as it would go against the fallen pine tree. "Squeeze through the branches. The snowcat is 50 yards to the left," he yelled, though his voice was almost instantly swallowed by the deafening roar of the storm. Evelyn pushed herself through the narrow gap between the freezing steel and the jagged pine bark. The moment she stepped into the open air of the Devil's Jaw, the sheer violence of the polar vortex hit her. The wind didn't just blow. It battered. It was a physical wall of moving ice that immediately knocked her to her knees in the waist-deep snow. Visibility was 0. The world was a chaotic, swirling void of blinding white. Dominic grabbed Evelyn by the collar of her parka and hauled her upright. Meline emerged behind them, clutching the waterproof case to her chest, her eyes wide with terror as the cold instantly stole her breath. "Hold on," Dominic screamed over the wind, grabbing Madeline's arm and hooking Evelyn's hand onto his heavy survival belt. They began to march. Every step was agonizing. The snow was a thick, resistant sludge that pulled at their legs. The wind slashed at the exposed slivers of Evelyn's face, the cold so extreme it felt like searing heat. She couldn't feel her toes. Her mind began to fog, the terrifying lethargy of hypothermia already whispering to her brain. 50 yards, she told herself. Just 50 yards. Suddenly, a massive, dark shape materialized out of the whiteout. It was a tracked, military-style utility vehicle. A snowcat, its heavy engine rumbling over the sound of the wind, its headlights cut weakly through the blizzard, illuminating the swirling snow. "There!" Dominic yelled, pulling them forward. They reached the heavy metal door of the passenger cabin. Dominic wrenched it open, the wind desperately trying to rip it from its hinges. He shoved Meline inside first, then Evelyn. Evelyn collapsed onto the heavy vinyl bench seat. The interior of the cabin was cramped, smelling of diesel and old coffee, but it was gloriously, incredibly warm. A heavy industrial heater was blasting hot air into the small space. Evelyn ripped the frozen blanket off her head and gasped for air, her entire body shaking uncontrollably as the heat met her frozen nerves, causing a painful, prickling sensation. Meline sat opposite her, curled into a tight ball, shivering violently and clutching the pelican case. Dominic climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the heavy door shut, sealing out the deafening roar of the vortex. The sudden quiet in the cabin was jarring. "Everyone okay?" Dominic asked, pulling off his frozen gloves and rubbing his hands together in front of the heater vent. We're alive," Evelyn chattered, wrapping her arms around herself. "Thank you. God, thank you. Don't thank me yet. We have a treacherous drive down the mountain," Dominic said, shifting into gear. The snowcat lurched forward, its heavy treads crunching over the buried limestone and dead pines. Evelyn looked out the thick, frost-edged window. They were leaving the Devil's Jaw. They had survived. She had the evidence to destroy Arthur and avenge her husband. "Agent Rossi," Meline croaked from the back seat, her voice trembling not just from the cold, but from something else. She was staring intently at the rearview mirror, where Dominic's reflection was visible. When Thomas contacted the FBI, who exactly did he speak to? "He spoke to me, Meline. I handled the intake," Dominic replied, keeping his eyes on the treacherous, snow-blind path ahead. "He described you to me once," Meline whispered, her grip on the pelican case tightening. "He said the agent he met at the dead drop was young, had a military haircut, but Thomas mentioned something else." Evelyn frowned, turning to look at Meline. The young woman's face was completely drained of colour, her eyes fixed on Dominic's right hand, which was resting on the steering console. "He said the agent wore a very specific watch," Meline continued, her voice rising in pitch. "A standard-issue bureau timepiece. But you're not wearing a standard-issue watch, are you, Dominic?" Evelyn looked at Dominic's wrist. Glinting in the dim dashboard light was a heavy, ostentatious gold chronograph. It was flashy, expensive, entirely out of place on a field agent's salary. Dominic's posture instantly stiffened. "And Thomas didn't set up a dead drop with the FBI," Meline said, her voice now a terrified, panicked rush. "I remember the night he made the call. He didn't think the feds could protect me from Arthur's local influence. He called the only people who could scare Arthur. He called the buyers. The cartel." A sickening, heavy silence fell over the small, heated cabin. The rumbling of the snowcat engine suddenly felt like a trap springing shut. Dominic slowly reached over and engaged the snowcat's parking brake. The heavy vehicle ground to a halt in the middle of the blinding whiteout, surrounded by miles of freezing, impassable terrain. He didn't turn around. Instead, he unholstered a sleek, matte black semi-automatic pistol from his tactical vest and rested it casually on the center console. Thomas was a smart man. "Mrs. Mercer," Dominic said smoothly, his voice losing all traces of the desperate savior he had played minutes ago. It was replaced by a cold, calculating edge. He knew Arthur was skimming from his own shipments. The bosses down south weren't happy. Thomas offered us the ledgers to prove it, in exchange for wiping his debts and a safe passage for his little stowaway here. Evelyn's blood ran cold. The man sitting in front of them wasn't law enforcement. He was the very criminal element Arthur had been supplying. "So why are you here?" Evelyn demanded. Her hand slowly, agonizingly creeping toward her deep coat pocket, where the heavy revolver rested. "Because Thomas died before he could hand over the proof," Dominic said, finally turning to face them, his eyes flat and devoid of empathy. "And without those ledgers, the cartel can't justify a move against Arthur's territory without starting a war. We need the paperwork. Hand over the Pelican case, Meline, and I'll drive you both down to the highway. Keep it, and I'll leave you both out here in the snow to freeze." Meline clutched the case to her chest, shaking her head. "If you take this, Arthur wins. You'll just leverage it to take over the route. Nothing changes. I'm not here to change the world, sweetie. I'm here for the books," Dominic sneered, lifting the pistol and aiming it directly at Madeline's chest. "Pass the case to the front. Now." Evelyn's fingers closed around the cold, textured grip of the revolver in her pocket. She was trapped in a metal box in the middle of a deadly storm with a cartel fixer. Thomas had died trying to play these monsters against each other. Evelyn flipped the safety off the revolver inside her pocket. "Dominic," she said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. Dominic glanced at her, momentarily distracted. In the confined space of the snowcat, the click of Evelyn cocking the hammer of the revolver echoed like a thunderclap. In the confined, insulated space of the snowcat's cabin, the mechanical click of the revolver's hammer locking into place was louder than the roaring engine. Dominic's eyes darted from the rearview mirror to Evelyn. For a fraction of a second, the cartel fixer's polished, arrogant facade cracked, revealing genuine shock. He had severely underestimated the widow sitting in the passenger seat. He assumed grief had made her fragile. He didn't realize that grief had burned away everything she had left to lose. "Evelyn," Dominic said, his voice dropping its smooth cadence, replaced by a harsh, dangerous bark. "Take your hand out of your pocket. You don't know what you're doing. You shoot that thing in here. You'll deafen us all. And you'll likely miss. It's a Smith & Wesson. 38 Special, Dominic," Evelyn replied, her voice eerily calm, devoid of the tremors that had racked her body just moments before. "It's loaded with hollow points, at a distance of 3 feet, through a wool parka. I don't need to be a marksman to hit center mass." Meline was frozen in the back seat, clutching the Pelican case so tightly her knuckles were white, her eyes darting between the sleek semi-automatic pistol in Dominic's hand and the bulge in Evelyn's coat pocket. "Thomas made a deal with my employers," Dominic pressed, slowly shifting the barrel of his pistol away from Meline and toward Evelyn. "He wanted to protect her. Hand over the drives, and I honor his last wish. You both walk away. You keep the farm. The bank debt disappears tomorrow morning." "Thomas didn't know you were going to kill him," Evelyn said, a single, hot tear tracking down her frozen cheek. "He thought he was buying his life back. You murdered my husband. It was just business," Dominic shouted, losing his composure. "Arthur was out of control. The bosses needed the shipping lanes secured. Thomas was a loose end. Now, take your hand out of your—" Evelyn didn't wait for him to finish the sentence. She pulled the trigger from inside her coat. The explosion inside the small, metal-reinforced cabin was apocalyptic. A blinding flash of orange fire erupted through the charred, smouldering hole in Evelyn's heavy parka. The noise was a physical force, a concussive shockwave that slammed into their eardrums, leaving behind a piercing, high-pitched ringing that drowned out the howling blizzard outside. Dominic screamed, a raw, guttural sound of pure agony. The hollow-point bullet hadn't hit center mass. Evelyn, hampered by the awkward angle of her pocket, had struck him squarely in the right bicep. The impact spun him violently against the driver's side window, shattering the glass with the force of his skull. The matte black pistol slipped from his shattered right arm, clattering onto the metal floorboards between the seats. "Madeline, get the gun!" Evelyn yelled, her voice sounding distant and muffled through the ringing in her own ears. Madeline lunged forward over the center console, her frail frame fueled by a sudden spike of adrenaline. She scrambled on the floorboards, her fingers closing around the grip of the cartel pistol just as Dominic, gasping and clutching his bleeding arm, tried to kick it away. Madeline scrambled backward into the rear seat, racking the slide of the pistol with a terrifying, desperate efficiency. She aimed it directly at the back of Dominic's head. "I have it! I have it!" She screamed over the wind, roaring through the broken window. Evelyn withdrew the smoking .38 from her ruined coat pocket and levelled it at Dominic's chest. The smell of cordite, burning wool, and copper filled the cramped cabin, a nauseating cocktail of violence. "Move," Evelyn commanded, gesturing toward the passenger seat with the barrel of the revolver. Dominic was hyperventilating. "You think Arthur is bad? The people I work for will burn Oakhaven to the ground to get those ledgers. Then let them come," Evelyn said coldly. "But you're not going to be around to see it. Move to the passenger seat. Now." Whimpering in pain, Dominic clumsily dragged himself over the center console, clutching his ruined arm to his chest, and slumped into the passenger side. Evelyn slid into the driver's seat. She had grown up driving heavy farm equipment, tractors, and log skidders on these very ridges. She looked at the snowcat's console. It was a complex array of hydraulic levers and transmission gears. But the foundational mechanics were the same. She disengaged the parking brake, dropped the heavy vehicle into a low, grinding gear, and slammed her foot on the accelerator. The snowcat roared, its massive treads biting into the deep, fresh snow, hauling them forward into the blinding white oblivion. "Keep the gun on him, Madeline," Evelyn yelled over the wind and the engine. "If he moves his left hand, shoot him in the knee." "Where are we going?" Madeline asked, her voice shaking violently as the reality of what they had just done set in. "We can't go to the police. Half the county deputies are on Arthur's payroll. They'll hand the drives right back to him." "We're not going to the police," Evelyn said, gripping the heavy steering wheel as the snowcat crested the eastern ridge, beginning its perilous, slipping descent toward the valley floor. "Then where?" Dominic choked out, spitting blood onto the dashboard. Evelyn stared through the windshield, her eyes locked on the faint, dark tree line emerging from the whiteout below. "We're going home. We're going to end this." The descent from the Devil's Jaw took 40 agonizing minutes. The snowcat slipped and slid down the treacherous logging roads, the heavy treads struggling to find purchase on the sheer ice beneath the snowpack. To the time they reached the valley floor, the blizzard had begun to lose its devastating, hurricane-force edge, transitioning into a heavy, relentless snowfall. The sky was beginning to lighten into the dull, bruised grey of early dawn. Through the swirling snow, the silhouette of Evelyn's farmhouse slowly materialized, and parked squarely in front of her porch, exactly where it had been yesterday afternoon, was Arthur's massive silver heavy-duty truck. Beside it sat a dark, unmarked SUV. Arthur hadn't left. He had known the storm would trap Evelyn, and he had used the whiteout as cover to tear the house apart looking for Madeline's hidden evidence. Evelyn didn't slow down. "Brace yourselves," she screamed, gripping the steering wheel. Instead of turning into the driveway, Evelyn aimed the 5-ton military snowcat directly at Arthur's silver truck. Dominic screamed in terror, bracing his good arm against the dashboard. The snowcat slammed into the side of the silver pickup with the force of a wrecking ball. The sound of crunching metal and shattering glass echoed across the frozen valley. The impact pushed the truck sideways, completely crushing its rear axle and pinning it immovably against the massive oak tree in the front yard. Arthur's escape route was officially destroyed. Evelyn threw the snowcat into park and killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. "Stay behind me," Evelyn told Madeline. "Keep the gun leveled." Evelyn kicked her door open and stepped down into the knee-deep snow. The front door of the farmhouse burst open. Arthur Mercer stood on the porch, a heavy pump-action shotgun gripped tightly in his hands. Behind him stood two massive, rugged men, the enforcers he used to keep the local logging unions in line. Arthur's face was a mask of absolute, unhinged fury. The farmhouse behind him was utterly destroyed. Through the open door, Evelyn could see that the living room walls had been smashed in with sledgehammers, the floorboards ripped up, and Thomas's antique furniture smashed to splinters. "Evelyn," Arthur roared, racking the shotgun. "What the hell have you done?" Evelyn didn't flinch. She marched straight toward the porch, the Smith & Wesson revolver hanging loosely at her side, her ruined parka smoking slightly in the freezing air. Meline stepped out of the snowcat behind her, clutching the Pelican case in one hand and the cartel pistol in the other. Arthur's eyes snapped to Meline, then to the heavy black waterproof case. The fury in his eyes was instantly replaced by a predatory, desperate gleam. "Meline," Arthur said, his voice dropping into a deadly, mocking purr. "Back from the dead. And you brought my property with you." "It's over, Arthur," Evelyn said, stopping 20 feet from the porch. The snow was falling silently around them now. "The drives survive. Your empire is done. You think you can walk onto my land and dictate terms to me?" Arthur sneered, raising the barrel of the shotgun toward Evelyn's chest. "I own the sheriff, Evie. I own the judge. I'll shoot you both dead right here on the porch, claim you tried to attack me, and I'll have the county coroner sign the death certificates by lunchtime." "You don't own the people," Thomas called, Evelyn said. Arthur frowned, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his scarred face. "What are you talking about?" "Drag him out, Meline." Meline reached into the passenger side of the snowcat and pressed the barrel of her pistol against Dominic's neck. Groaning in agony, the cartel fixer stumbled out of the vehicle, his high-visibility suit soaked in dark, freezing blood. Arthur's two enforcers immediately stepped back, recognizing Dominic. They lowered their weapons, a sudden, palpable terror washing over them. "Do you know who this is, Arthur?" Evelyn asked, her voice carrying across the silent, snow-covered yard. "This is Dominic Rossi. He's the man your buyers sent to retrieve the ledgers, because they know you've been skimming, Arthur. They know you've been stealing from the cartel." Arthur's face went entirely white. The shotgun in his hands trembled. He looked at Dominic, who was leaning heavily against the treads of the snowcat, clutching his shattered arm. "Tell him, Dominic," Evelyn demanded. "You're dead, Arthur," Dominic spat, his voice weak but laced with pure venom. "The bosses know about the ghost trucks. You think you can burn a hole in our pipeline and hide in the woods? They sent me to get the books. And they sent a cleanup crew to Pittsburgh. You have nowhere to run." Arthur panicked. His carefully constructed world of local corruption and bullying was useless against the ghosts of the international syndicate he had betrayed. He spun around, looking at his two enforcers. "Shoot them!" Arthur screamed at his men. "Shoot the fixer! Get the case! We can burn the ledgers and tell the bosses he never made it!" The two men didn't move. They looked at Dominic, then at Arthur, and then they slowly, deliberately dropped their weapons into the snow. They were thugs, not martyrs. They raised their hands and began walking backward toward the tree line, abandoning Arthur to his fate. "Cowards!" Arthur bellowed, his face turning a mottled, violent red. He swung the shotgun back toward Evelyn, his finger slipping onto the trigger. "If I'm going down, Evie, I'm taking you and Thomas's little rat with me." "No!" Meline screamed. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She didn't think about the legal ramifications, the moral weight, or the terror of the moment. She only thought of Thomas's truck burning on Miller's Ridge and the frozen, terrifying tomb beneath the Devil's Jaw. She raised the Smith & Wesson and fired 2 shots in rapid succession. The heavy hollow points struck Arthur square in the chest. The force of the impact threw the massive man backward. The shotgun discharged harmlessly into the porch roof, raining splinters of wood and snow down onto the steps. Arthur crashed onto the ruined floorboards of the farmhouse he had coveted so desperately, his eyes wide, staring blankly at the bruised morning sky. He didn't move again. Evelyn slowly lowered the revolver. The ringing in her ears returned, accompanied by the absolute, crushing exhaustion of the past 24 hours. The gun slipped from her numb fingers, landing with a soft thud in the snow. Meline fell to her knees, clutching the pelican case to her chest, sobbing uncontrollably as the nightmare finally broke. Evelyn looked down at her hands. They were shaking. She turned back to the snowcat. Dominic had slid down the side of the treads, unconscious from the blood loss. His breath a faint, white mist in the freezing air. Evelyn reached into her pocket, pulled out her cell phone, and dialed 911. "This is Evelyn Mercer," she said, her voice steady and clear as the dispatcher answered. "Send the state police and an ambulance to the Mercer farm and patch me through to the FBI field office in Philadelphia. Tell them I have the Oakhaven ledgers." The freeze of the century broke 3 days later, leaving Oakhaven buried, but slowly thawing. The state police, bypassing the corrupt local sheriff's department, swarmed the property. Dominic Rossi survived his gunshot wound, only to be indicted alongside 40 members of Arthur's smuggling ring, systematically dismantled by the evidence on Madeline's hard drives. Evelyn was cleared of all charges. The shooting of Arthur Mercer unequivocally ruled as self-defense. With the cartel pipeline severed and the bank debts wiped clean by federal asset forfeiture funds, Evelyn found herself the undisputed owner of the sprawling, silent timberland. Meline entered witness protection, leaving Pennsylvania behind forever. Evelyn never returned to the Devil's Jaw. She had the heavy steel hatch permanently welded shut and buried under 50 tons of limestone gravel. It remained a secret, silent tomb deep in the earth, a final, enduring monument to a husband's desperate love and the chilling winter that forged a widow's unbreakable survival.